Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be from Sinai to the modern day, written in oral Torah lineages from Iraqi Jews, Syrian Jews, and Yemenite Jews. So as you've seen in other videos, what I've basically presented is the issue of exactly when you look in the written Torah itself, what exactly was the process of the Torah itself becoming a written text, which was a number of, decades, if you will, of oral transmission and oral Torah before there was ever a written text. And again, if you look at my previous videos, I showed how, for example, the word Torah in Hebrew doesn't, when you look at the etymology of the word, it doesn't mean written text on its own. What it essentially means is instruction, teaching, things like that, because it comes from a verbal root that, deals with instruction or teachings, and, it can mean law, things like that. But these are just ways of trying to translate the concepts of the word into the English language. But for example, it wasn't until 40 years after the giving of the Ten Commandments or the Torah at Mount Sinai that you actually had a written text come online, and that means you had 40 years of actually practicing things that, for example, would eventually be written in the text, but not every practice and not every thing that was ever said during those 40 years was actually entered into the text. And this is something that's pretty clear and known because, for example, when you look at a number of the mitzvot, the commands that are in the Torah, as well as the hukim, there's no real description of many of them. And I've covered that on other videos where it doesn't fully describe how to actually do them. And that essentially, you also had situations where the word Torah is being used to describe things that happened way before you even had a written text, such as, for example, all the way in parts of the Torah from Exodus 16 to 20. And then further, we have a situation where the word Torah is used in a number of situations prior to there being a text. But I've done this in other videos. So then again, we have to look at the book of Deuteronomy 32:7 or Devarim, Perek Lamed Avet. You have a situation where it says, Zachor Yomot Olam, Zachor Yomot Olam, Binu, Shenoth Dor Wador, Sha'al Avicho Yajethecho, Zechonecho Yamru Loch. Translated, what this means that if a Jew is, for example, and this is a command from Moshe Rabbeinu to the Israeli/Jewish people, that, if we go back and look through the generations, and, for example, let's say we have a question of what exactly happened in the past. It says here, Sha'al avicha v'yajedcha. So ask your father, and he will tell you. Zechonecha v'yamru loch. So we also go and ask the zekonim. So again, person says, okay, I'm going to take this to heart. And what if I, for example, come from these three communities, the um, Jewish community of Iraq, the Jewish community of Syria, and the Jewish community of Taiman, of Yemen, and ask what kind of things will I find? And in this video, I'll actually show you what you would find. Okay, so then before we get further deep into it, when we look at the, most ancient Jewish communities, across the, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, in Europe, these are the kind of leadership we find that came back. And every single one of these leaders who come from ancient Jewish communities, have ancestors, all the way to themselves who claim that there was a written Torah and an oral Torah given at Mount Sinai. So as I've shown before, if you were to break down the different, communities that are considered to be the main Jewish communities, not disregarding ones who are not considered to be main, but this is kind of when people like speak in Hebrew nowadays in modern Jewish speak. This is the theory, not theory, but the communities we find that we're usually describing when it comes to Torah Moshe, and even, like modern people know the term Orthodox Jew, but in other Jewish communities the word wasn't used. So we'll use this to describe the different types of communities that essentially agree upon the national revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai, written and oral, the written text of the Torah, which came about 40 years after, that period, and then sources for the oral Torah. So then let's look into the issue of lineage. If we were to look into the Tanakh itself and using the oldest complete Tanakhs that we have, or the most I guess you could say ancient forms of the Tanakh that we have, we can look at the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex. And again, there's fragments that predate this, especially when you look at what's called the Dead Sea Scrolls. But I'm looking in terms of the actual text of the Tanakh that can be sourced today in Hebrew. These are the two texts that you'd mainly be looking at, the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad. Now I'm going to look at the Aleppo for the next part of what I'm going to be describing, simply because it's a bit older than the Leningrad. The main difference is that the Aleppo Codex is missing sections in the Torah, and the Leningrad has those sections there, for example. So essentially we'll look at the Aleppo Codex because if we're looking at a part of the text called Divrei Hayamim, that's the part that we're looking at, and that part is complete. So if we look throughout Divrei Yamim, going from, first, which is in English, you would call this First Chronicles, chapter one through, verses 1 through 8, we are given a list of Israeli generations from Adam all the way to the first Commonwealth, meaning the first temple period. And it covers some of the main ancestral lines of all 12 tribes. And essentially what this is doing is establishing, the source for written and oral Torah throughout those generations. And again, one of the things that's important to note is that it doesn't give you every single Jew that was ever born ever. That was not the point of the text. It simply is giving, for example, the overview, especially in light of, there being no more, that the Commonwealth, the first Commonwealth, the first temple period had been over at that point. And they were basically trying to collect whatever information was available to make sure they maintained, the culture that existed as well as the governmental structure as much as possible. Now, if we also look in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which in English we call Ezra and Nehemiah, it also gives a list of generations dealing with, specifically those who came back from the exile, that had been the Babylonian exile. And one of the things that's important to note about this exile is that the exile that happened in the area of Yehuda was predominantly the leadership being exiled, where the average common Israeli person was in exile. So generally speaking, the generations that they list are going to be those who came back from the exile who were part of the leadership. So again, this doesn't cover every single, Israeli, every single Jew that was around. It's just simply the best that they had from the files, not files, but I guess you could say the sources that they had amongst, which you would mainly say would be the leadership, because it wasn't the goal, for example, to try to record every single Jew they could find, because that, generally speaking, is something that would be on a personal level that every Jew would maintain, for example, the knowledge and history of their family line. So then another source that we have for the lineage that comes from Mount Sinai to at least the Talmudic era, for example, comes from, the Mishnah, which is also found in the Talmud itself, because the Mishnah is actually in the Talmud also. So in the Mishnah, it actually gives a list of like the Torah being transmitted from Hashem, the creator of all things, to Moshe Rabbeinu, going all the way to like the period of the Mishnah. And exactly like how it was passed on. And again, the point of that transmission that's shown is simply to say, if you will, the all stars of the Torah for every generation, and who passed the oral and the written and the oral Torah in every generation. So lineage is provided there. No, what I want to do is to do a deep dive into, the three Jewish communities I mentioned earlier, the Iraqi Jewish community, the Syrian Jewish community, and the Yemenite Jewish community, and the claims of, the transmission of the written Torah and the oral Torah into those communities. Because again, as I mentioned before, within those communities, there's agreement about the national revelation of the Torah, written and oral at Mount Sinai, the written Torah and the sources of the oral Torah, meaning that there's no, debate that there's an oral Torah, and most of the sources about it, for example, within the Iraqi Jewish community. So if you look at a previous video that I did about the ancestry, the descendants of David HaMelech or King David through Solomon, one of the things I showed previously is that there's a number of modern Jewish families, such as the Dayan family, the Shemach family, the Shaltiel family, Ibn Yahya family, the Abravanel family, and the Ben David family, who claim modernly to be descendants of King David through Solomon. So one of the things we can look at is there's a genealogy that I was able to get my hands on that is from what's called the Rish Galuta, or the Exilarchs, from King David, and it's a text that was basically from around the time of 1100 CE, and it was found in a Geniza, which is like a storage place in Egypt. So essentially, if we look at that text, what we find is that this is an ancestry detailing, a Jew by the name of Zakkai ben Azariah, who was also his, meaning that Zakkai was the son of Azariah, and Azariah was the son of, Shlomo. So essentially, when we get to this, again, knowing that this is around 1100 CE when this text came about, for example, and that if you look at the blue, that's Zakkai ben Azariah. So if you look at the red, that's the generation of Mount Sinai. So from the time of Mount Sinai to Zakkai ben Azariah, what we're talking about is the transmission of written and oral Torah throughout all the generations listed here, because it lists, for example, like son to, to father, for example, or father to son. So it starts with Zakkai and goes backwards through his line to his father, his grandfather, and then his great grandfather, and so on, until you get all the way to the generation at Mount Sinai, which is listed in this area here. If you go a little bit further, for example, you have Peretz, the son of Yehuda, the son of Yaakov, the son of Yitzhak, the son of Avraham, so So basically, Jacob, the son of Judah is listed here, the son of Jacob, the son of Isaac, and the son of Abraham. So this is like another, like basically proof text of the claim that's made of how the written in the oral Torah came from the time of Mount Sinai to, the time of, about, you would say about the time of 1100 CE is when you would have, for example, this being passed down. So then, if we look at the Jews of Syria and look at the fact that they also agree on the national revelation of the Torah, the written in the oral Torah and Mount Sinai, they agree of the written text of the Torah, and they agree of the sources of the oral Torah. So within the community of the Syrian Jewish community, there's also some, different families that have a claim to be of, from the descendants of David HaMelech or King David through his son Shlomo HaMelech or King Solomon. And that family, one of the ones I'm going to show here is the Dayan family. So within the Dayan family, there's for example, I was able to find an ancestral line here, or family tree, if you will. And basically, what the text does is it starts out by, giving kind of introduction of the information and its relevance, pertaining to the leadership of the Jews of Syria, and exactly that leadership being descendants of, King David, for example, through Solomon, which, is essentially why they were like, leaders in the Syrian Jewish community. And it's specifically, from the city of Aramat which I think nowadays is called Aleppo, if I remember correctly. So essentially, if you look in the blue section here, this is like saying it starts, here with David HaMelech or King David of Yisrael and Shlomo his son, and goes backwards, for example, or goes forward, for example, from him, and then it ends, which is somewhere around a man by the name of Ezra, who was the son of Mordechai. And then, like for example, that is this person named Ezra's son was Aaron bin Ezra, for example. So this particular text, it gets us like really, I think, past like within the last several hundred years or so, if I remember correctly. So essentially, what we're looking at is so far we've seen two texts that get us like past a certain point in history, past the Second Temple period, past the Talmudic period, and it gives us enough information about Jewish communities that once we go past these particular family trees, we have a lot more information from a lot of different Jews that lived in these regions. So then the last community we're going to look at now are the Jews of Yemen. And this is the community that I'm a part of. And this is the community that I, have the most information about in this area, for example. So, again, Jews of Yemen, and when I say Jews of Yemen, just like the Jews of Syria and Iraq, I'm talking about all the Jews, held this, particular claim, about the national revelation at Mount Sinai, the written Torah, and the sources of the oral Torah. There is no Jewish community that I could find in Yemen that claimed there was no oral Torah. Now, again, the claim is not just simply that there's an oral Torah. The claim is that every, Yemenite Jewish family claims that they had ancestors that go back to the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, and that their ancestors received a written and oral Torah together, and everybody agrees upon what sources, are basically or valid sources for what that oral Torah was. So here you have a genealogy of a man by the name of Yeshua, who was the son of Aharon, Yeshua bin Aharon. So he's listed here in the genealogy, and this was written around the time that he was born. For example, just for example, at least this particular genealogy was passed on during the time he was born to give his genealogy going backwards. And this here is the area where it gives the genealogy from Mount Sinai. So essentially, what it gives is I think it is like 91 names that show up in this. Now he lived, Yeshua ben Haron lived during the time of about 1500s. So essentially, this list starts right around here, where it says Yaakov, Delekav, Shemeh, Yisroel. So it talks about Yaakov here, or Jacob, and then Judah, his son, and then it goes further and further up till it gets about here to the generation of Mount Sinai, and then goes further to, this individual who was born around the 1500s. And then from the 1500s, we have a lot of information about, a lot of different Jewish communities and things like that from that time. And we know that this is the one of the transmissions of the written and the oral Torah throughout the generations from Mount Sinai to, about the 1500s, written and oral transmission of Torah. Now, another family lineage that we have of written and oral Torah comes from about 1498 by, the birth of a man by the name of Yether ben Shlomo. And that's him listed here. This is Yether ben Shlomo. So Yether ben Shlomo in his family lineage, from this with this particular text being from 1498, for example, which would have been recorded through generation to generation and basically recopied, for every generation. This here in the red is the area of the generation of the giving of the Torah written in around Mount Sinai. So what this means is that, most people agree that, for example, when we deal with these communities, that these are some of the most ancient Jewish communities in the diaspora, meaning that they were exiled or were in exile, you know, for, a number of like several thousand years. Now, the interesting thing about the Jews of Yemen is that there's a claim, that, for example, the exile in Yemen actually, from Jews from the land of Israel to Yemen actually started somewhere around the First Temple period. There's a number of like stories from different Jewish communities in Yemen of how their ancestors first arrived in the land of in Arabia, essentially. So one story is that during the time of Jeremiah, there were a group of like I think 80 like Jewish like heads of households who heard the prophecy that Jeremiah had said, stated, and essentially believed him, and then they left Israel and went into like long journey into Arabia, and then they settled in an area called Hejaz, and essentially in that area, that's where other Jewish communities kind of came and congregated, and then eventually they moved further into southern Arabia where Yemen is. And there's another story, for example, that there, were a group of Jewish soldiers who, were sent there, for example, during the time of the First Temple period. And then there's like a number of stories of other Jews, Jews who left, who either went to like Babylon at a certain point and then moved further into Arabia, for example. And then, for example, what you see here is a Jewish man who's a Yemenite, who's like, basically copying, a Sefer Torah, meaning he's basically transmitting the written text of the Torah based on a previous copy of the written Torah that's from several, generations earlier. So what you see here is examples of Sefer Torahs, the five books of Moses, written on what's called jawil, which is a particular type of, it's basically made from animal skin. And it's essentially these texts act in some cases, they're actually copied the same exact way from what you see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, meaning that when you look at Dead Sea Scrolls, they survived for thousands of years. And one of the reasons is because of the processing and also the animal skin, the way it was processed and made for like writing on, because when Jews write Torah scrolls, we write it on animal skin. And this particular type called jawil actually in many cases can last like more than 1,000 years or more, in some cases, maybe even 2,000, because we know the Dead Sea Scrolls were written in the same way and they lasted in many cases, there's some of them they found to be potentially about 2,300 years old. So if you want to like verify the information that I've talked about in this video, a good book that I recently got my hands on in order to produce this video is called Hashemot HaParatiyim Bekarav Yehudei Teman. And essentially what it does is it goes through all the different names of different, private names of different Jews, and it goes all the way starting from Jacob, meaning Yaakov ben Yitzhak, all the way to like, basically a number of Jewish families that, go way back to the modern era, for example. So by using this book and using the information in it that was, basically researched by the author, who was Dr. Moshe, I think Javra, yeah, Javra, I think is his name. Essentially, what he did was he got basically names from every source of information he could find for different generations in Yemen that leads us into the modern era. And essentially, this book does is shows the oral Torah that was passed down from generation to generation, and exactly who transmitted it, who taught Torah, and who passed that down from generation to generation, showing that there's both a written and an oral Torah. So, essentially, if you go in the next book that I actually looked at, but I didn't actually buy this one. But I've actually went through most of the book there. It's called Sohar Lechapisat Ganezei Teman, and essentially it also includes a number of family trees, which essentially like one of them is actually the front of this book here. This is a family tree of different Levites who lived in Yemen. And one of the things that it also shows is that there's a list here that one part of it deals with like the generation of Mount Sinai, and then it kind of skips a number of generations and goes further and further into like more of like I think probably around the 1500s or something like that also. And this also includes some of that genealogy. And then one of the last books that I would suggest for anyone who wants to research this is Encyclopedia LeHokmei Teman. And essentially what this does is it collects like all the different types of, all the different leaders of the Jewish communities in Yemen, going back at least I would say some cases like about 1,000 years, and tracing them, like, what their histories were, what kind of things they wrote, and both the written and the oral Torah that they transmitted throughout the generations. So what this does collectively is this shows something. This shows that, for example, if someone were to say that there's no oral Torah, My response to that person would be, okay, well, maybe just speak for yourself. Maybe your ancestors didn't get an oral Torah. Maybe they only received a written Torah, but nothing else. Then that's your particular claim for your own family. But in terms of the different communities that I've shown recently, and all the things I've shown here, that there are communities that say that and show that they have a written and oral Torah transmission. And the information I provided in this video is that transmission. So this is a Havever from the Chronicles of a Havever. Take care. Thank you for listening, and bye.